The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was asleep, the enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. Jesus said, "Let them both grow together." In the name of God, who asks us to live with wheat and weeds, the wheat and the tares. So, it's good to be with you. And this was a busy week at the Kelleher-Macgill household, because this was the week that the Atlanta Kellehers, Melinda, Brian's sister, and Ann, his mother, moved to Cumberland. And Friday morning, after Brian dropped his mother Ann at the Kensington to begin her life there, and we prepared for Melinda to settle into her apartment on Fayette Street on Saturday, we were talking about the week that was, the week of moving and unpacking. And we determined that there were all sorts and conditions of moments this past week: anxious moments, tense moments, frustrating moments, moments that we might want each of us to run into the woods, screaming and pulling our hair out. But there were also moments of grace and kindness and laughter and meeting angels unaware. All through the week, there were moments of good seed and weeds, the wheat and the tares, as "Come Ye Thankful People Come," that hymn talk about. And so it is whenever we gather as God's people or our community for a family move, for Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter, summer reunions. Most of the time, there's never a perfect event. There's an event with weeds and good seed. That's true with our daily lives. And in Ignatian practice, that's why there's the examen, which takes place at the end of the day. And as we're ready to go to sleep, we take a little time to bring before God our challenges of the day, the places we fell short, those places of grace, those graces of hope, those places of hope and love. In the examen, we recognize that our days are full of wheat and tare moments. I seem to be saying quite a lot. Well, that's the silver lining of the pandemic. There are things we're realizing in this time, this very hard time, that are pieces of hope and things that we want to hold on to that we've forgotten. Lynn Unger has written a poem for these times entitled "Pandemic," and I wanted to begin the sermon with this. What if you thought of it, the pandemic, as the Jews consider the Sabbath, the most sacred of times? Cease from travel, cease from buying and selling. Give up, just for now, on trying to make the world different than it is. Sing, pray, touch only those to whom you commit your life. Center down, and when your body becomes still, reach out with your heart. Know that we are connected in ways that are terrifying and beautiful. You could hardly deny it now. Know that our lives are in one another's hands. Reach out your heart. Reach out your words. Reach out all the tendrils of compassion that move invisibly where we cannot touch. Promise this world your love, for better, for worse, in sickness and in health, so long as we all shall live. What if we lived our lives always this way, swimming through our days through the wheat and the tares together? On Friday morning, a few of us gathered at Rose Hill Cemetery to tour the Gates family graves. John and Sue Gates took us to several locations in Rose Hill where Gates family members were laid to rest, and there are a number in different places. There was the Stevens-Gates plot where the Gates brothers married the Stevens sisters who lived across the Green Street from each other. They're now buried on the hill. There was the family matriarch Jane Gates's grave. Jane Gates, born in the early 1800s as a slave, became a free woman, and with her sons and families, she is buried nearby or on the hillside a few yards away. On the way, we visited the graves of the Lynn family who donated the land on which Rose Hill sits, and we saw the monument to the Union dead. We stopped at the memorial to the Confederate dead, which was erected by the ladies of Cumberland in 1912 to the heroes who died fighting for the lost cause. Just behind the Confederate memorial rose the Lowndes marker to Governor Lowndes and his daughter Elizabeth. All manner of Cumberland folk are buried in Rose Hill. For everyone's wheat, there is also a tare, or a weed. That is the kingdom. Everybody belongs. But what do we make of the explanation of the parable by Jesus? He says to let the weeds and wheat grow together until the harvest. And then at the harvest, he will tell the reapers to collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles and gather the wheat into the barn. The weeds in bundles will be thrown into the fiery furnace where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. What are we to make of this part of the parable if everyone belongs? We could chalk up the parable to being just an addition to Jesus' original parable by Matthew or Matthew's community. But I see it as a vision of what happens if we do not live with the hard stories of our history, our weeds, our tares, and sort them. That kind of work does feel like a fiery furnace, a weeping and gnashing of teeth. But this shadow work, as Carl Jung might say, is where we find spiritual gold, spiritual riches that we must wait and work for in patience. A walk through the cemetery is always a good thing to do, especially when death seems close. It's often, though, the last thing we initially want to do when we're fearful. But I've found myself drawn to Rose Hill since March. There seems to be wisdom abounding in my walks, wisdom from the ancestors. How did Jane Gates, a former slave, find a way to build a dynasty of Gateses on Green Street? How did Miss Elizabeth Lowndes find the courage to stand up to the all-male vestry and have our glorious Rizpah window installed? We're always swimming in a field of wheat and weeds, carried along by those who have been in that place before. There are current underneath. Poet David White speaks often of his mother, who he says never knew a stranger. In his home in the north of England, that was where folks came when they didn't know where else to go. His mother was known as the heart of kindness in his town. But she came from a life of weeds, which threatened to overwhelm her. He told the story recently in one of his podcasts of how his mother at age 13 was a great singer in the community, and she won local competition after local competition. She eventually came to the finals of the regional competition for voice. And the night of the finals, her own mother lay gravely ill at home. David's mother wanted to stay with her mother, her own mother, and not go to the competition, but her mother insisted. Go, she said. So David's mother went, and she won the competition. But when she returned home, her mother had died. In that moment, her world began to fall apart, and eventually she fled her native Ireland for a mill job in England at age 15. Along the way, she met angels unawares, strangers that would see her to safety. She could have seen them as weeds, or the alien, or something to be thrown away, ignored. But she learned that great gold, spiritual riches lay in reaching across to another. Poet David learned that from her, and that when we feel the most in the weeds, to open our hearts to the stranger, and hope blooms. I think that's why we can never count out what we perceive as the weeds among us. And we must not count out the weeds within. There's wisdom and teaching in the shadows of our lives. David's mother was the caring heart of her village because she knew great loss. And she could live with another in their weeds because she knew her own. Jesus asks us to take it all in and live in it all, weeds, wheat and tares. Swim in the midst of the fields of love and loss. Love through the fire to a new life. So I want to end with this wonderful poem by David White called Self-Portrait, which was inspired by his mother. It doesn't interest me if there is one God or many gods. I want to know if you belong or feel abandoned, if you know despair or see it in others. I want to know if you are prepared to live in the world with its harsh need to change you. If you can look back with firm eyes saying, this is where I stand. I want to know if you know how to melt into that fierce heat of living, falling towards the center of your longing. I want to know if you're willing to live day by day with the consequence of love and the bitter, unwanted passion of your sure defeat. I've been told in that fierce embrace, even the gods speak of God. Amen.